Welcome to part 2 in this video series. Previously, we looked at the bass drum placements within a 16th note subdivision against a standard 8th note hi-hat position. Today, we're going to be continuing into the second part of this set, specifically the snare drum and combined sets, and start looking how we can break away from solely moving the bass drum and look at moving the snare drum and moving the bass drum and snare drum together. To begin, we're on page 26, set 1.1, the snare drum set, and this begins in very much the same way as with the bass drum. We start with the bass drum on beat 1 and the snare drum on the downbeat on beat 2 of the bar. To remind you, we start with this basic pattern. Very, very simple. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now for this set, we're working in 2/4, so just 2 beats of that pattern, 1 and 2 and. In this instance, the bass drum is going to stay where it was. It's going to stay on beat 1 the entire time, but the snare drum is going to displace. It's going to begin by displacing across the 4 16th note slots, the 2, the E, the and the Then we're going to deal with groups of 2 snare drums, groups of 3 snare drums, and finally 4 snare drums on all 4 16th notes. So let's begin with the single stroke permutations. This is where we just have one snare drum moving across the 4 16th note slots available to it. This comprises patterns B, C, D, and E. I'll play them 4 times each. They sound like this. Listen to how the bass drum stays consistent, but that snare drum displaces by 1 16th note each time I move on. That takes us back round across the 4 16th note permutations. We can now progress through F, G, H, I, J, and K, comprising the 2 snare drum placements. They start on the 2 8th notes, and then they run through the various 16th note permutations. So let's hear those, just a few times each. And there we have run through the possible permutations for playing 2 snare drum strokes across the course of that second beat of the bar. Patterns L, M, N, and O comprise 3 snare drum placements, again running through the 16th note permutations. They sound like this, just a few times each. And finally, exercise P at the end is where that snare drum plays all 4 16th notes across that second beat. Now, as we did in the first video with the bass drum placements, we can start exploring some new vocabularic ideas by combining any 2 of these exercises. So like I did then, I'm just going to choose 2 at random. We will do G and N. G and N. And as a 2-part combination, it sounds like this. Let's take that a touch faster. Let's take the right hand across to the ride, and the hi-hat can keep time playing the quarter note. And we can hear how quite a nice groove is created, and this gives us access to those ideas, and it helps us work on the technical execution required to actually coordinate that pattern in the first place. So again, we're working on multiple things at once. Now, one of the things I mentioned in the bass drum video previously, which is not available to us in that particular process, is how we can start moving the accent and the ghost notes on the snare drum. If we take N and as an example, it sounds like this. In this exercise, the snare drum is playing on the 2, the E and the So it's playing 3 of the 4 possible 16th note positions, not playing on the and, not playing on the second 8th note of that beat. So this essentially means there are at least 3 possible positions in which to play an accent. If we choose one of those notes to be an accent and turn the other 2 into ghost notes, we can actually quite dramatically change how this groove sounds. To begin with, I will play with the accent on the downbeat and I will retain ghost notes on the E and the So it gives us a pattern that sounds like this. It's pretty typical. We've got a nice accent on the downbeat and then 2 ghost notes following it. It gets a little bit more interesting when we displace the accent. So we are staying with the same pattern, the snare drum on the 2, the E and the but this time let's move the accent away from beat 2 and move it onto the upbeat 16th note instead. So beat 2 itself is going to be a ghost note. The accent is going to be on the E and then another ghost note on the to E. To E. This is going to give us quite a nice syncopated sound. I'll start nice and slowly so you can hear how that accent has been syncopated. A touch faster now. And finally, we can move that accent to the final 16th note of the bar. So the first 2 16th notes, the 2 and the E, become ghost notes, and the accent is right at the end on the final 16th note, nice and slowly to begin with. And a touch faster. Now, of course, on their own, these don't necessarily work in a musical context, especially that last one where there was this strange offbeat accent on the last 16th note of the bar. However, of course, from an exercise perspective, we are simply familiarizing ourselves with the technical execution of actually playing that. We are also incorporating that sound, that rhythmic idea, into our vocabulary. To explore this, we can start to combine 2 of those different options. So I'm going to stay with pattern N, that same snare drum placement, but I'm going to play the first instance with the accent on the 2 itself, on the downbeat, and the second instance with the accent on the second 16th note. So the first half of the bar, the accent is on the 2, the second half of the bar, the accent is offbeat on the E, the second 16th note. Nice and slowly so you can hear it first. And as we start to speed this up a little bit, we will hear this really recognizable pulse starting to form. Now, of course, this can be made a lot more interesting if we start varying the bass drum as well. So when we move across to page 27, the so-called combined set, we find that the bass drum placement matches the snare drum placement. So if we stick with exercise N, which was working well for us, we've got the 1, the E, and the on the bass drum, and the 2, the E, and the on the snare drum. The 2 rhythms match each other. So without any accents, just the basic groove as it's written, pattern N on page 27 sounds like this. Notice how the bass drum rhythm matches the snare drum rhythm. Now, without the inclusion of those accents and ghost notes, it sounds a little bit flat, so we can start repeating the same process now. I won't labour the point, so what I will do is the first instance of this combination I will play with the accent on the downbeat, and the second instance I will offset it to the second 16th note. So the first time through the accent is on the 2, the second time through the accent will move to the second 16th note, the E. Nice and slowly, it sounds like this. And again, quite a powerful style funk fusion groove is created. Now, we can make this even more interesting by sticking with this combined approach, but combining two different patterns. So if we combine, let's pick any two again, G and N. Yeah, that's the one we did last time, isn't it? Let's do G and N again. So G has two consecutive 16th notes. On its own, it sounds like this. We put those together with N and we get a 2-beat combination, G, N. And you can hear an interesting combination is created. Finally, within this process, we can play with the accents. So I will stick with G, the accent will remain on the downbeat, but when we move on to pattern N, I will displace that accent onto the second 16th note. Nice and slowly to begin with. When we speed that up, we get something that sounds like a really nice funk fusion groove. So maybe we can move that across to the right cymbal, see what we can do. I will keep time with the hi-hat as usual. Now, admittedly, that is quite an unusual groove. It's not necessarily something that I would play, but that's kind of the point. I am exposing myself to new ideas, to new vocabulary, to new ways of thinking, and I might find, okay, on its own, if I repeat that constantly, it doesn't necessarily work. But if I've practiced that, if I've worked out the coordination, I've explored the various application ideas, I have that in my arsenal, so to speak, and maybe I can pull it out just once or twice within part of a larger improvisation. And so on. I couldn't really describe what I did there specifically, except I was using the basis of that G-N combination to inform some of my ideas. And that's something I wouldn't necessarily have encountered otherwise without working on this material. Now, carrying on the natural process, we're looking at pages 26 and 27 together this time. We can choose different combinations of exercises within that set to create slightly more interesting combinations. So this time, let's take pattern G from the left-hand page from the snare drum set and pattern N from the combined set, and we'll see how that fits together. We're combining two of the different previous ideas now. So G from the snare drum set and N from the combined set. And you can hear again how a slightly different variation on the overall theme has been created. We've now no longer got that bass drum completely matching the snare drum, we've got a slightly more dynamic movement across both of those lines. Now, finally, we get to the point where there are actually too many combinations to appear even in a book such as this. Now, there are tens of pages within only this first set when you encompass the bass drum positions, the snare drum positions, the combined positions, and all of the fat back exercises which contain a bass drum before and after the snare drum downbeat. To get to the point where we have every single bass drum permutation against every single snare drum permutation would have taken many more pages again. So what we can do here is start to use a process of memorization. And this kind of goes against the book, but it's one of the unfortunate necessities of practicality. Without having a book that was literally thousands of pages long, we were never going to get it all within one volume. That said, all of the material is here. So what do? First of all, we choose an exercise from the snare drum set. This is where the bass drum remains constant, but the snare drum changes. So for the sake of example, I will stick with the one we have been doing. I'm going to choose exercise N from page 26 on the snare drum set. It sounds like this. And quite simply, I'm going to memorize it. I'm going to learn it to the point where I no longer need to look at the sheet. Now from here, I'm going to turn backwards a page to the bass drum set, and I'm going to run through all of the exercises within that set, but I'm going to apply the snare drum ending that I just memorized. So ordinarily, exercise B from the bass drum set is this. So I'm going to apply that ending from N from the next set, and it becomes this. So I'm applying the snare drum ending from the snare drum set to all of the exercises within the bass drum set. So I will do each one a couple of times, and this time you will hear how the bass drum progresses through the 16th note permutations, and that snare drum stays constant, but using the different variation, using the snare drum rhythm from the snare drum set. And we have another array of really interesting combinations. Now, to finish this off, and I really want to hammer home this point because this is where the actual development and growth happens, we are going to choose two of those particular combinations. So I'm going to do F and O. So on its own, F sounds like this. It has two 8th note bass drums using that new snare drum pattern. And O has a slightly different bass drum pattern. Putting those together to create a 4-beat combination, we get this. Perhaps we combine the ghost note accent approach that we were exploring previously. So for the first half of the bar, I will retain the accent on the downbeat. For the second half of the bar, I will displace it onto the second 16th note. And hopefully by now, you can start to see how the process works and how this book can be helpful in helping you achieve that. So to recap this process, there are two main goals happening together. The first of those is to actually tackle the technical coordination, the physical execution required to play this material. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, it is exposing us to these ideas which we can then explore to a deep level so that we incorporate them into our vocabulary. So whenever you see someone like me improvise, you are necessarily seeing the material with which I am most familiar. When you see someone like Dave Weckl improvise, you are seeing the material with which Dave Weckl is most familiar. And you have to actually acquire that vocabulary from somewhere, learn it, study it, internalize it to a very deep level. And I've found in my own practice and in my own teaching, this sort of book has been very, very helpful in helping me achieve that, and with my students as well, because we can very clearly see at a glance, all laid out very clearly, where everything lines up. There's no visualization required. In part 3 of this series, I'm going to tackle the remaining set, which is the linear set. And this is linear in the sense of the patterns played between the bass drum and the snare drum. That hi-hat is still going to retain constant. So it's not true linear, because there will be some instances of unison playing, but they are linear patterns insofar as the bass drum and the snare drum is concerned. So stay tuned for that third part. I hope to see you then. In the meantime, good luck with your own practice. Thank you very much for watching. And as always, if you enjoy what I do, there are plenty of resources on my website, including video lessons, face-to-face lessons, workshops and study days at my studio, and of course my array of publications as well. So please check that out if you're interested. I hope to see you then. Thank you very much. See you on the next one.